Every single state has a mechanism to try a child as an adult and uses it, to be sure. Just really makes me worried as an anchoring point to how we view our children.
Thank you so much. You're doing really important work, but just tell the audience what made you want to work on this issue.
Hey everyone, I'm Callie King-Guffey, and I have a background in public policy with a focus on the rights of children. I worked at UNICEF right after my undergrad. So I worked at the United Nations International Children's Fund for nearly 7 years. Got to witness the U.S. hold other countries accountable to a lot of human rights standards that fails to comply with itself, and decided to then focus on U.S. policy reform. So now I'm at the Campaign for the Fair Sentencing of Youth, a U.S.-based organization, and we focus on abolishing life without parole sentences for children.
Was that something you were always passionate about? Did you grow up being passionate about the rights of children?
I did. My sister was impacted by various systems and was frequently wondering why there's such a lack of support and resources for families in particular who are desperate for helping a child that gets deemed troubled, and became really passionate about the fact that these systems that are quote unquote designed for children often fail them and are often incredibly antagonistic to families and are so resource dependent.
So when you start to examine that from the United Nations perspective, and then you start to see it from our own perspective here in the United States, do you start to look for a legal framework? Is that where we can make change?
Yeah, so it can't just be laws. And so I want to acknowledge that laws are one piece of the puzzle. It also has to be cultural norms, a whole host of interventions. But what I was inspired by were advocates at the state level that were pushing for juvenile justice reform specifically. And they were referencing international law. So they were saying the U.S. does not comply with the Convention on the Rights of the Child when it comes to trying children as adults. And our state in Illinois, I think it was that I first came across, fails to uphold this international standard. And it was successful in passing that reform in that state. And so I started to look into it and thought it was really fascinating because the U.S. doesn't ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child, but still it seemed to have this moral authority or persuasive power to get stakeholders to push for change.
So as you start to see that, one of the big things is that America is happy to tell others what to do, but not so happy to focus on what it should have to do, yeah?
Yeah, child marriage is a good example of that, where the U.S. State Department has in one of its strategic plans the goal to end child marriage in other countries and around the world, and it's legal in 40 states.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
So the school to prison pipeline, it's like a child can get written up for something, go to detention, and then it just starts a cascading level of things that end up with the outcome of their life being horrible, or at least not optimal. How do you see that?
Yeah, the school to prison pipeline is one of the biggest catalysts for child rights violations in the U.S. The scorecard that I worked on with Human Rights Watch doesn't narrow in on the school to prison pipeline, but it does look at the minimum age of juvenile jurisdiction in states. So that means the age in which a child can be arrested and put into juvenile detention, tried in juvenile courts. And international law says that that minimum age should be 14 years old, actually encourages 16 years old, and no state complies with that standard.
Why do you think that is? Because if you ask people what they think about whether we should do the right thing by children, they would say yes, but then in fact it doesn't. Now we see that in sentencing guidelines with artificial intelligence, where you have things interlocking with other things, and by the end of it, somebody's having a bias against them. Is it a similar sort of problem?
Yeah, it's such a good question. The why is something that I kind of land on a different answer every day. Is it that we need to go back to the basics? If we can't agree that children shouldn't be married or sentenced to life without parole, is it just a huge lack of understanding of the brain science and what experts and common sense say about children? Or is it vested interests? The why is, I think, the next question to ask. Now we know that child rights violations happen at a large scale in the U.S., which a lot of legal scholars were denying and assuming that the U.S. complied with these international standards. So now we know that they don't. And Jesse, the why keeps me up at night.
Is there an attempt to do away with the statistics governing these things so that we see a thing as we did in the last government in the United States where we just said, hey, science is bad. We don't want to see any of these statistics. Is it something where we don't even allow the problem to be identified clearly?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Perhaps a lot of it is intergenerational trauma. Like we've internalized the treatment that we experienced as children, and we just say this is the way that it is, and we're going to continue to make life hard for children.
Right.
I think that could be one possible explanation that really does shy away from the statistics and the facts and the science. Politically, I don't see so much like a rejection of the statistics. That doesn't seem to be happening so much on these 4 issues, at least.
What are the 4 issues when we say there are 4 issues?
So the 4 issues that the Human Rights Watch scorecard looks at are child marriage, corporal punishment, juvenile justice, and child labor, specifically in the agriculture industry.
So fair sentencing, when we say fair, what do we mean?
That's a good question, too. Yeah, I mean, I would say that children shouldn't be sentenced at all, but they certainly shouldn't be sentenced as extreme as adults can be sentenced. They should not be tried as adults, and they shouldn't be sentenced to adult sentences.
You know, we hear all the time, I forget what I was watching yesterday, they're saying accountability. There's no accountability for children. We should hold the parents accountable. If we can't hold the parents accountable, we should hold the kids accountable. Like, how should we even view this in a way where we're not taking our own frame and just putting it over the top of something?
Yeah, I'm really excited about the potential to unlock that answer in our generation. There's a huge demand for holding children who commit harm accountable without necessarily perpetuating more harm. People like that. People want to do that. Then the answer to how to hold that child accountable, I mean, takes different shapes and forms and is oftentimes very community-based, but powerful frameworks like transformative justice frameworks are digging into that question and figuring it out.
What's transformative justice?
Transformative justice looks at the kind of underlying conditions of harm that was created. And so, for instance, with the sentencing of young people, our organization at the CFSY often cites the fact that 90% of children entering the criminal legal system have experienced intense levels of abuse, trauma, and neglect. So you could hold a child accountable who commits harm for that instance of harm, but if you aren't acknowledging the underlying conditions and trauma and abuse and neglect and the systems and the personnel that all went into the lead up to that harm, we're not going to really fix the problem.
So how about the rehabilitation? I mean, it's so complicated, and yet there are really violent crimes committed by children. And yes, unless it's just some deviation or mental illness, usually they're coming from someplace. How do we then give appropriate consequences? Where do they go? It's a resource problem as well. Who's going to pay for this? And you need buy-in from so many stakeholders, correct?
Yeah, you need buy-in. Yeah, and we need more case studies of brave stakeholders that are willing to try something different. It is a research problem.
Have you visited children in prisons?
I have. When I was at UNICEF, I used to teach a writing course at Rikers. So this was before New York raised the age in which children could be held at the Rikers prison facility.
Rikers was a pretty, serious prison. Were you just in cells, or were you in a cell block and then you went in a room? Like, how did you just take us in exactly what happened?
So it was a really wild experience because you had to get on a ton of different buses to get to where you needed to go. It was very intense, the amount of checkpoints. And
did you feel like you were disappearing behind the wall when you went in?
That's a really good articulation of how it felt. Yes. Of like going to see people who were disappeared from society, very, very isolated from humanity.
So did you walk into a room and there was just a single person in there, or what was that actual moment like?
The first time that I went, you had to go into different levels and so through different checkpoints. And I went into a room where there were a number of girls who had been incarcerated at Rikers. So it was maybe a group of 6 or 7 girls. I had to take the classes in sequences because there was a lot of segregation within the youth population. But yet these were girls. They were tiny.
Right. And were their minds at work in there back behind this thing? Were you positive? Were you depressed? How did you feel?
Yeah, I think how I felt was very upset. I think also trying to give them some stimulation and also just a genuine outlet and let them be kids for a minute.
And was there moments of play inside there? Were there moments where they were able to be a kid for a moment?
Yeah, we participated in a climate comic contest. So they were tasked with coming up with a hero that could save the world from climate change. They discussed what they had seen about environmental degradation in their own communities, and they got to drawing and storytelling, and they played. Yeah, they were kids. I still have some of the drawings today.
I assume you're anonymous in there and you're never going to see the child again once you leave because it's not part of the thing. What were your reflections on the last day? Was there infinite sadness? What did you think?
Yeah, I was passing the torch. So when I left UNICEF, there were other folks that were taking it up. And so that gave me some hope that there was some institutional change, folks that were really living by the message that we need to leave no child behind. And we can't go to our fancy UN headquarters in New York City and preach that message without really thinking about the children that we're walking by every day.
What happened to those girls, for example? What was their sentencing? And did you ever find out where do they end up? And once somebody's in, is it hard to change your life?
Yeah, from anecdotal evidence, it's hard to pull from, but I think we do know that the more contact young people have with the juvenile justice system, the more likely they are to come in contact with the adult justice system and so on and so forth. So the more prevention we can invest in, the better.
There are certain communities, you would know the specific ones, where a lot of kids seem like they just get put in jail as some form of a smaller version of an adult jail, if they're lucky. But then there are certain places in this country where they start to teach you a trade, and that seems in the statistics to lessen the recidivism. Do you have thoughts on this and how we get there to be less recurrent crime?
Yeah. One side note is that I remember being in a certain policy position in a government office and getting scolded for talking about youth prisons because youth prisons don't exist. They're youth detention centers.
Right.
And it's very, very important that you don't tell a lawmaker that you're talking about a youth prison. And yet, if you were to go to a youth detention center and compare it to an adult prison, they are the same. So it's interesting how language, I think, in this space can get co-opted to soften how we treat children as if we're treating them differently when we're really not. But that's a side note. I think the training and investment in child and youth development to any degree is a win.
And do you see there being alternatives to incarceration?
Definitely. I think that's another example in which I think language can get co-opted. So I would push the industry to making sure that alternatives aren't learning directly from models of incarceration. But that's what we need to really look towards is trauma-informed, healing-centered accountability mechanisms that don't require detainment and deprivation of liberty.
Is one of the issues the juvenile court system itself isn't open to these alternative theories? Or, are there people struggling at the juvenile court system to try and make these things more equitable?
It really depends on the court system. So even within a state, a lot of variation can happen. So that was interesting with the scorecard, for instance, grading each state on how they treat young people in the juvenile justice system as a way to disaggregate the United States treatment of children in the juvenile justice system. But even within a state, it can depend on the court, it can depend on the county, it can depend on the judge. And there are a lot of good people setting up innovative things.
Isn't there always going to be that problem? Because, justice should be blind, but it's not blind. So it's like, how do you get away from there's one good judge, one bad judge? Is there a way around any of that?
Yeah. If you or I could crack that code, we would, I don't know, win some Nobel Peace Prize.
Yeah.
You said somebody was doing innovative work in that area. What is that innovative work?
I have been in contact with a now retired judge in Oregon that was really pushing for what she called wraparound services. So really was trauma informed, really was a healing centered approach. I would be interested in juxtaposing it with kind of transformative justice definitions today. And, the legal standards ask us to consider the mitigating factors of youth, but she was like digging deeper into those mitigating factors and really thinking through, okay, who are the people in this child's life that we can surround them with love and care and support, that every child needs to thrive. And I was really inspired by her position as a judge digging into this, because she was speaking languages that I was more used to, child psychologists speaking. So trailblazers are needed.
Is there a youth crime epidemic at the moment?
That also depends on where you are. Comparing rises in crime. And there are some cities and counties that are experiencing rises of youth crime. And it is an important issue that I think across political spectrums, across demographics, there's concern about. What I think I get afraid of is that the response is going to revert to these disproven policies. Lengthy sentences do not deter crime. They do not make us safer. And talking about adolescent brain development, deterrence theory in general is just not effective. These are kids, they don't know how many years they're looking at in prison when they are trying to survive in different street conditions. I just hope that we as a society can start to look at this concerning fact that some cities are experiencing rises in youth crime and respond accordingly, not revert back. I get really excited about the fact that I work with a lot of people who were incarcerated as children, in fact sentenced to die in prison as children, who have since been resentenced and released primarily because of Supreme Court decisions that have reversed their sentencing. And they are the very people that are on the forefront of youth prevention efforts. They're the very people that have been in their communities mentoring young people, are driven by the hope to prevent any child from making the same mistake that they made. And so I get excited about the intergenerational impacts of empathy that we could have for children in the past and how that can really give back to children today.
In a way, it's sort of a very fundamental human rights question around how we as different societies want to deal with the plight of children in our different communities. And so different parts of the world are probably practicing better or worse. And is there a common way to look at all these issues so that you can come to a common understanding?
You can look to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most ratified human rights treaty to date. And it really does provide a blueprint to measure how well your laws are protecting children from violations. It's fascinating that so many countries have subscribed to the standards set. I think it really does speak to the fact that there is this universal moral code that we want to protect our children. There's something visceral about it. I think a lot of us feel it. And if we can come up with a treaty that nearly every single UN member state has ratified, the universal authority of it provides at least a framework to start with. And then, of course, requires individual cultural interpretation and integration, internalization. And that's going to vary. But we can have these grounding rights that we agree on.
The United States has not ratified that, have they?
They have not. They are the only UN member state that has not ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is particularly wild because the US was so heavily involved in the creation of the convention. I just think oftentimes folks will say, well, we don't want the UN to tell us what to do, or we don't want other countries to tell us what to do. We're rejecting what we are telling everyone else to do. These are our own psychologists and experts. So when we reject the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we're rejecting our own expertise and voices that have told us this is good public policy.
In a sense, can that be that the institution itself, the UN itself, is not old enough yet to actually start to pull some of these strings tight around some of the, because it isn't just this issue, it's lots of issues. And it might just be that the institution's not old enough to, become a strong institution. I mean, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, surely the UN needs to be reformed, but I don't think it's as much of an issue of the UN system as it is the US federal system. I think that ratification of an international treaty requires a lot. and is one of the reasons why the Human Rights Watch scorecard looks at states, because getting anything passed at the federal level requires a ton of buy-in and a ton of political sway. And so states are the laboratories of democracy in which change is actually happening. And that's where we can funnily look at to see where international law is getting internalized in the US is at the state level. So kind of usurping the federal system, I guess.
How do we change this narrative? And who are we talking to? Because ultimately, their story is out, children getting more violent, there's more hate crimes, youth crimes. What has to happen and on what level, sort of systemically, structurally, to work on this?
So many good narrative change strategies that exist and that I think many are pursuing. What this scorecard tries to do is grade adult lawmakers the same way that children are graded and put some responsibility on adults. Like, you want to point fingers at literal children, you want to call children guilty, and we need to take some responsibility of guilt ourselves. If our systems are failing children, are saying that children can be married or worked in hazardous conditions in the agriculture sector, if we can hit children in penal institutions where in adult prisons that would be an egregious violation of their rights, we're really degrading children, and we need to take a responsibility for that. And I think that's one of the major starting points that I would like to see about changing the narrative, is that this is a collective effort that we need to kind of start to look internally as adult lawmakers.
Are there specific states where you go, well, wait, they're really trying and something, amazing is coming out of there?
Yeah, New Jersey is ranked number 1, and they really are pushing the envelope. There are a couple of things that they could do. If you look at the scorecard, they'll have their blueprint of exactly what they can do to comply with international child rights standards. They've banned child marriage. They have prohibited corporal punishment in both private and public schools. So a lot of states, for instance, have prohibited corporal punishment in public schools, but not in private schools. And that becomes a really big concern, just given the jurisdiction of private schools.
What keeps you up at night? Which specific parts of these issues do you think we're close to being able to make a change on?
Oh, man. A lot keeps me up at night. I think that the juvenile justice issues really do keep me up at night. The fact that we treat children as adults freaks me out. That no state prohibits transferring children to adult court. Every single state has a mechanism to try a child as an adult and uses it, to be sure. Just really makes me worried as an anchoring point to how we view our children.
It seems like it's not that difficult to get a child, tried as an adult. And does that not defeat the purpose of there being a distinction between the two?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. The entire creation of the juvenile justice system was an acknowledgement that children are different than adults and needed a different system. Some of the concerning language that I have seen pushed is that some children aren't children. And that's just incredibly dehumanizing and has so much disregard for the conditions that too many children in this country grew up with.
What do you mean when you say they're not children? What does that mean to you?
To me, when someone says a child is not a child, it is saying that they don't get certain protections that other children get because their brain must be in a completely different category than a child's. And we just know categorically that's not true. All children are children. All child brains are child brains. And in fact, a lot of evidence is pushing our acknowledgement of adolescent brain development to recognize that brains don't develop until later in life, past 18 years old.
Yeah.
Right.
So to say that a 16 or 17-year-old is not a child, it's a talking point that I think requires a lot of unraveling.
Now, you've been working in this field for a long time. How do you feel it's going? Do you feel like we're reaching some new ground, some new ideas?
Definitely new ideas. I think there's a lot of creativity in the child rights advocacy space that really gives me a lot of hope. I do feel quite new to the U.S. child rights advocacy landscape coming from the international system. But with that said, the genius and the creativity and the potential that this child rights movement has to tap into some really shared moral truths. There's a lot of politicization across the country, and there's also a lot of agreement that can be had on children.
Well, it's fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing with us, Callie. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, and it's such great work that you're doing. It's brave and it's tough.
Thank you. Appreciate you.